Okay, so those of you who have been here all day probably know at least 4 of the panel members. So we have Prateep, social scientist. We have Sheldon, consultant. We have Kevin, who just spoke for Ducks Unlimited. Mike Waddington, professor, McMaster University. And then a new panel member, Merrin Macrae. So Merrin is a professor here at Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment. A lot of her work has to do with the effect of agriculture on water quality, nutrient cycling, etc. And we specifically asked Merrin to join the panel today because the Ramsar theme of this year is wetlands and agriculture. And so we haven't really touched too much on that subject, except maybe in the last few talks about conversion of wetlands to agriculture. So thank you, Merrin, for joining us. So what we are going to do, so we're going to ask a few large questions. We'll ask one of the panelists to take the lead on providing his or her views on the question. And then other panelists can intervene also. And if there's a burning question from the public, we'll take at least one question or no question or 2 questions, depends a little bit. To keep in time, we'll devote about 10 minutes to each question. But I would like to have at least 5 minutes at the end of the panel after we go into all 5 questions for questions or remarks or reactions from the audience. So the first question is going to Mike. I'll give you the mic. And so the question is, what are the greatest current and future anthropogenic threats to wetlands in addition to fire?
So this is a really tough question because this is global, which means it includes all types of wetlands, which means it can include all aspects of anthropogenic impacts, direct or indirect. So when you have a question like this and you don't know the answer right away, the first thing you do is you ask your own students. So we did this on Wednesday. I had my undergrads, grads, and postdocs, and we went around the table. And what became really interesting is we all had our own perhaps personal biases. So we've done our lab, in a way, we're kind of peat disturbers, as we like to say. We look at a lot of direct anthropogenic impacts. And that was reflected in the discussions there. We've worked in local wetlands, same as ones that Merrin's worked at, where agriculture is the biggest impact. We've worked in peatlands where mining, and wetlands where mining is direct impact, peat harvesting, and so on. And the very last one I picked up was from my own postdoc who just put land use. And so I can sort of answer the question shortly by just saying land use. But as a hydrologist, I really subscribe to some really amazing work that was done by my mentor at McMaster University, Hawk Wu, published a really good paper with Winter. A wetland is where it is for a reason, which means, in a way, anything that humans do, be it direct or indirect, affects that wetland. Be it even a different part of the watershed, just you can have an impact 10, 15 kilometers away, which impacts that wetland. So I think if we just say land use as a general role, I would say that is currently the biggest impact. But the future becomes an even trickier question, and I think it relates back to the talk I gave. And I really believe that the work by Brad Wilcox at Texas A&M, he's got it right, is that when it comes to a lot of ecosystems, the impact is going to be shifting from direct land use impacts to transformative change driven by climate, changes in climate, and more so driven by extreme events, be it drought or fire or insects, what have you. And we discussed in our lab, and we feel that's not going to be, that's going to be more felt in the north. I would argue that most of the impacts are generally been in the south, where a lot of the land use impacts have been currently and past, but that future we're going to start to see impacts which are mainly driven by climate. So that's an indirect anthropogenic impact.
Any of the other panelists want to discuss it? Because I'd like to actually ask a question. If we also saw a great talk by Prateep on a lagoon where essentially the human element cannot be taken out of out of it. So it's not as if it's a northern boreal wetland where we're thinking more about possible direct and indirect causes, to a wetland that originally has very few humans around it. So Prateep can maybe speak to those type of social ecological wetlands.
This is not my question. This is not my question.
No, it's not your question yet. No, you're not off the hook yet.
I was just going to wait for my turn, and then I would have touched upon that. I think it's a two-way process. Definitely, there are anthropogenic impacts on the ecosystems. There, where ecosystems are degrading, but at the same time, we need to consider what kind of changes in human system can come from changes in the ecosystem itself. In the resilience sense, they talk about fast variables and slow variables. And if you look at the fast variables, ecosystem processes and changes in the ecosystem services are very fast most of the time. And you could see them, you could perceive them, you could make plans, and then you could try to address or not address them. At the same time, the kind of impact human systems receive, these are all guided by slow variables. And slow variables are invisible, dormant most of the time, and they are cumulative in nature. By the time there is a cumulative impact on the human system, things have gone beyond a certain level that you cannot perhaps address. So changes in the human system would be more permanent in many, many ways because it touches upon not only the economic aspect of people's lives, it touches upon people's identity, culture, religion, and as I would explain in my question, when my question comes, their entire connection or the relationship with the environment itself. So I would say it is a two-way process. So ecosystem processes impacting humans and anthropogenic processes impacting ecosystem processes. We perhaps do not know how to strike a balance there, and that's where we need to work more and more.
Does anyone from the audience want to add something to it? So land use, human ecosystem interactions, possible exacerbated by climate change or modified by climate change. Everybody? There we go.
I just want to get your reaction to not just land use as a sort of categorical way of being a banner subject, but the more I kind of look at land use planning across the globe, I feel like there's a really strong push still toward the monocropping of everything, whether it be housing or food or what golf courses, whatever we're putting across the landscape. So not just land use as a topic, but the diversity of land use change that we do make and how that sort of interacts with all of this as well.
Do you want to respond to that? No?
No, I was thinking about something else, but I thought
Okay. Is there another question?
Yeah. In addition to the greatest, or having just one greatest threat.
For the live feed, you need to speak into.
In addition to the greatest threats that we have, can't we add regional trends? I mean, tropical wetlands are probably one largest threat that boreal or different regional threats.
The answer is yes. No comments?
Yes. No, absolutely, and that was sort of the difficulty we had in answering the question, and sort of our own personal biases and where we are and what we see in the news and so on, and that's not temporally bound either. And it's worth noting that a lot of wetlands are being impacted today on things which occurred 1, 2, or 3 decades ago. And so there's that lag effect as well, but certainly we could categorize different regions as having very big pressures, and certainly deforestation and drainage in the tropics is by far one of the biggest threats.
I mean, the answer is of course yes, because we live in an integrated system, so everything is connected. So I would not see how boreal forests would not be impacted by what we do in the lowlands or anywhere else. So we should bring more and more attention to that integrated nature of things. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll get to the next question. It's Prateep's question. So the last term there is growth. I mean, there's a couple of heads in, but no, don't worry about it. So is wetland protection compatible with current modes of economic development that aim to maximize economic growth? And so we asked Prateep to start the discussion?
I would start with a no, because I mean, I would go into details of what kind of protection we need, but at the same time, I would start off by saying, is economic growth enough? Because when I say we live in an interrelated and integrated world, perhaps economic growth is not enough. By saying that, when we talk about economic growth in the formal sense or in the policy sense, we look at GDP or GDP per capita to explain a variety of things, even to the extent that we calculate, how can you overcome poverty through GDP per capita, which doesn't make any sense because you just take the GDP of a country and divide it by the number of population, and thereby you don't actually talk about the real people. So what kind of economic growth we are talking about, and thereby, I would say this kind of a calculation where you try to achieve economic growth in the stricter sense of the term, thereby only try to achieve GDP, that doesn't match with a protection plan for wetlands. Forget about wetlands for any kind of resources itself. I would say no, because we need to look at a few things. Protection for whom? Are we talking about protection for the species, protection of wetlands for biodiversity, protection of wetlands for people and their livelihoods and the associated things that they bring with them? So protection for whom is one question that we need to clarify in our minds and in our policies. The second question I would ask is protection by whom? Is it policy that can bring those bigger management and protection initiatives and sustain those, or there are other actors and other important actors and stakeholders that can be brought in? I work with a lot of poor people in one part of the world, but I always stand up for them and say, can they be the managers? So can protection be done by them? When I say protection be done by them, it starts from scratch. It starts from planning, building the problem, understanding the problem, planning for it, strategizing, making strategies for them, and institutional building, and whole set of things that would come in terms of protection, and thereby bringing also collaboration at the policy level and other layers of actors itself. So protection for whom, protection by whom. And then the third question is protection of what? Again, protection of, so I work in a lagoon. I always look, if you stand in the middle of a lagoon on a boat, you look on the one side, it's connected to the sea, and the other side, it is connected to the farmlands and the forest. So it is not an isolated resource. So wetlands are not isolated resource. When we say protection of a wetland, it automatically brings in protection of other interconnected resources again. So if I can't protect my forest, I won't be able to protect the wetland itself. And that's an important, crucial point that I want to make here, that wetlands doesn't exist in isolation from other resources. And it has to be seen in that holistic term. The fourth point I would like to bring is protection of what? Again, related to my first point in terms of protection for whom, whether you want to protect the species or the biodiversity or people itself, or a combination of things, which is an ideal situation, and I would prefer that to happen, And so if we aim for that, so it becomes another crucial question in terms of what do we protect, So it's a combination of things, and that makes it more complex. Having said that, what do we have currently? I would say, listening to some of the presentations since morning, and my exposure to other existing work and research and policies elsewhere, I would say that we have probably sufficient amount of knowledge and wisdom to talk about protection and also deal with protection issues. It's just that we don't want to do it. In a policy sense, in a practical sense, we don't want to do it. So there is an implementation problem. We have international conventions and treaties, and Ramsar being one of them, to provide an umbrella approach to protection of wetlands. So we have those higher level protection mechanisms or approaches that could help us to do that. We have, I would say that compared to 20 years before, in many countries have solid plans, programs, and policies now in place to talk about conservation and protection of wetlands, compared to 20 years. Just that, again, there is an implementation problem. There is a problem in terms of, bringing that into action. So we have those things in place. It's just that we need to reevaluate those things, as one of our speakers said, that we need to make a comprehensive plan, we need to reevaluate our existing policies, and thereby ask ourselves questions in terms of why have we not succeeded, I would say no, economic development doesn't contribute or is not compatible with wetland protection, because we still keep talking about protection because somewhere we have failed in protecting our wetlands. Numbers are dwindling in terms of how many hectares have we reduced. And just take, for example, how much wetland we have lost in the Greater Toronto area, which comes out of the presentation. So we have failed, and that's why I would say it's not compatible. I would conclude by making re-emphasizing a point that I raised in my presentation. Talking about human environment connections or disconnections. Can we make human environment connections or disconnection and take that as a measure to see in terms of whether the wetlands have been protected or not. If you find that people are being disconnected from their wetlands specifically, but from the resources also, we could easily conclude that we have failed in protecting our wetlands. At the same time, the reverse of it is if we see there is more and more relationship building and connections being established between people in the wetlands, we could easily say that yes, the protection has taken place and we have achieved something. The last but not the least point is there has been numerous efforts in terms of conserving our natural resources, including protections, without people. So we have no take zones, we have no human interference kind of protected areas that are in place, and there are debates around that. There has not been a single effort in the world, forget about again wetlands, any kind of resources to conserve or to protect environments which are rich in human environment interactions, and wetlands being one of the biggest example. So I would say that is one of the things that we need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the policies, we have the knowledge, but we lack the political will for implementation. Seems to be the big problem.
So maybe I'll just tag on. I'm not sure how much it speaks to the direct question, but Faisal talked about some of the efforts of the World Bank to work with a number of countries to develop natural capital accounts. So if that natural capital accounting process is sort of synthesized with the traditional accounts, and this is out of my league, I'm not the economist, but if there's a true recognition of natural capital as having economic value, and that becomes part of your consideration on how growth and how much growth and so forth.
So that would be certainly a step forward. You had a comment? You have to speak in the microphone.
Sorry, my name is Abdullah Al-Mamun. Actually, I am friend of Prateep, and our zone is almost same and working area as well. So when the issue is like economic development, so I think most of the audience here will agree, like without economic development, who will care the development? So the big question is like, we need the economic development, at the same time we try to balance this development. So this is the tricky part. So we are losing the natural capitals, and we say like we would like to conserve a species. I'm a fisheries biologist basically. Then I started working. Did a master's in natural resources management to learn the policy things. So I try to understand like what actually the scientists want, and what actually the community level needs. So this is kind of imbalance always like you can find. So when we are damaging, like we blame the economic development, like if we talk about the shrimp cultivation, then let's say in Bangladesh, most of the coastal mangrove are cleaned for shrimp cultivation. So what is happening? Where the money is going? Is the most dependent group like fishers are involved with this process. So this is kind of imbalanced with the economic development. But what I'd like to say, like, if we are going with some sort of only scientific ideas that we would like to develop this ecosystem, we'd like to conserve these species, sometime it may not fit with the need of communities. So still we have planned, we have let's say area like conservation area, but they will still invade the area because they need they need to maintain their livelihood. So my point is, like, let's try to think in a sense of social ecological process. So if you don't actually care about the social process, the ecological process will not also work. So that is the key area we scientists have to deal with. It is the future challenge. So without economic development, people need to survive as well. I work with fisheries, let's say marginalized people. They are the fisher in Bangladesh and India. They have special castes, so when the wetlands are gone, they have no alternative incomes. So they are the most threatened group. So they don't care if we go with an idea like, I would like to conserve this dolphin. So who cares if I cannot survive? So this is the idea. Like, I'll finish, and I have a poster that shows a social ecological approach, and community can contribute to the people like us. What do you know? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to go on because otherwise we'll run out of time here. So the next question is, so Sheldon, to what extent can we replace natural wetlands by construction wetlands? It's a loaded question, I know.
So like Mike, when I first got this question and wondered how could we actually address this question, it's a very difficult one. I can tell you that from my own experience, my thought is that when we can hone in on a specific species or a specific habitat function, we can recreate to that particular habitat function or species perhaps quite well, especially if our understanding of the science behind that function is well understood. But to create a very diverse, sometimes very old wetland feature, I think is quite difficult just because of its own internal complexities. We all are aware of how complex wetlands can be and the ecosystem functions that drive them. And for us to recreate those hydrogeologic, hydrologic, water quality, terrestrial, aquatic inputs to replace what was lost. Oftentimes it may be technically feasible, but it may be economically or financially infeasible to that point. So my thought is that we can zoom in at a certain scale and recreate wetlands that are targeted, right? But they don't, at least at the start, and they may develop over time, but they don't, at least at the start, in their early development, because as soon as you build a wetland, it starts evolving, right? You don't have that level of diversity that you're trying to recreate. But I've asked Kevin, who is a much greater expert in this subject, to help me out here. And then perhaps, Rebecca, you can speak to it as well.
And for the record, Sheldon asked me about 5 minutes ago. So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. But I guess that one comment would be, wetland restoration in some cases can be fairly straightforward. And so I'm thinking about small depressional wetlands in an agricultural field where a farmer has run a couple of furrows out of the outlet of that basin to take the water off. And now he can run his equipment through the wetland and try to farm it. Well, it's not a it's not rocket science to say, got to restore the hydrology, so put a little plug in that ditch. And you're probably going to get pretty close to some of the functions that you had before, depending on what else is happening in the catchment area of the wetland, water quality and so forth. But I don't think we should always assume that it's very complex, and in some cases I think it can be pretty straightforward.
Rebecca, you've been put on the spot. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think that what you said is exactly right, that we can pick a particular function and through engineering target it and reproduce it somewhat successfully, but it's the whole suite of the ecosystem services the wetlands are providing that is very difficult to create from scratch. The kind of restoration you were talking about, ditch plug restoration, has been the most successful at doing that, but in cases where, say with strip mining, the wetland's been totally obliterated, we have not had a great track record at putting back the kinds of wetlands that were there before. So I sort of wish Jonathan Price was here to talk about that issue, but I think that we have to exercise caution and sort of invoke a bit of a precautionary principle when it comes to things like wholesale removal of fens or bogs, to think that we can put them back later. It might be a little bit of hubris.
Yeah, I can speak to that, having worked with John for a fair bit on building bogs. I think it's like Kevin said, it's not rocket science. We've got to get the hydrology back. And we can, that's why when I stopped doing less in restoration, started working on fire, is that we can learn a lot about disturbance regimes to understand more about building wetlands. But at the same time, if we're going to be constructing a wetland, there are a lot of natural wetlands that are going to be under threat, as I mentioned earlier, for the future climate change. And so if we're building a wetland, we may not want to build the wetland that we have right now. We may be wanting to build a wetland which will have the resiliency to withstand climate and also continued land use change. But I think we have a pretty good track record in building bogs.
At least we all agree we're not doing rocket science. So.
I just want to add to the conversation about constructed wetlands, the urban perspective. As to the question about how can constructed wetlands replace what has been the natural wetlands that have been replaced by urban areas, is that no, they can't, because in that case the hydrology is fairly complicated and you can't reproduce it even remotely similar to any kind of natural state. So what we're asking of a constructed wetland is much greater than in an urban setting than what we're asking of it in a natural setting, because we're applying these huge loads of storms like all at once. It's completely different than what it was. So now we're asking it to provide the same function that like wetlands in a much larger area would have provided. So we're asking a lot of our constructed wetlands within an urban, the engineered ones, I should say, the ones that Sheldon referred to as the engineered wetlands. Those ones, they need continuous maintenance because we ask so much of them.
All right, so we'll switch to the next question. All right, so how effective have provincial, national, and international policies and regulations been in slowing down the degradation and loss of wetlands? So that's for Kevin, and we're taking you out of your comfort zone of the provincial legislation.
Taking me out of Ontario. Here, what's my lip? Yeah, so I have some experience with what other provincial jurisdictions have done and what what the federal government in Canada has done. The short answer is they're not effective enough. I mean, I think even though that wetland conversion study that I mentioned showed that as of 2002 we had lost 72%, we don't have definitive data after that. There's been no sort of landscape-wide study after that. But all indications are, anecdotally, just watching what's happening on the land, is we're still going backwards. So, clearly the policies need to step up. I think there's the other challenge is, and I talked about this a little bit in my talk about, it's really important to try to assess how well that new policy is working, or when it's been around for a while, to see what you've learned from that. But that's easier said than done, because you're trying to tease out the impact of one particular policy change when there's a whole slew of other things happening around that wetland and economically and policy-wise, politics and all of that. It's very tough to attribute, the effect of a specific policy, unless you can, really control it. I'm not the scientist to speak to that, but so the Protected Greenbelt study that we looked at seemed to show pretty clearly that wetlands were protected from land development under the Planning Act. So things that go through a municipal approval process. That's as I said, that's a big step up. But as one of the attendees highlighted, the fact is there's this issue of sort of the leapfrog effect. When you have a hard line, a different policy framework, and then you have a less prescriptive policy on the other side of the line, it tends to drive some leapfrog development over to the other side. I live in Simcoe County, and there's lots of discussion about that in South Simcoe, which is just outside the Greenbelt line. And I guess this is more of a broader comment, but I would say in our 50-odd years of work here in Ontario, we've in the last 5 to 10 years have really shifted a lot of staff resources into the policy review. How do we convince government and industry to do more, to go to the next step or the next level, and actually protect more wetlands? Because we're more and more convinced that has to be part of the fix. Is a stronger, tighter policy world. I think today, still at the rate of loss we're seeing, it'll be virtually impossible to keep up with that loss by going through sort of traditional restoration and stewardship programs. We won't be able to keep up. That's certainly been the case in Manitoba. Drainage activities in some of the southern parts of that province continue are substantial. So unless there's some controls put on that, restoration activities won't be able to keep pace. So that's my view.
Kevin, I've got a couple of questions for you. Do you think that from a provincial policy perspective that the way we should go is we should broaden the definition of what is a significant wetland, to lower that threshold, so we, instead of just protecting 40% of what's remaining in the province, we expand it to 60-70%? Or do you think that our policy issues relate to exemptions that enable the potential to develop within that wetland fringe, right? That 120-meter boundary that has to be observed.
Yeah. Sorry, in the first part, the first part of that question was, because I thought I had a great answer.
Should we be
Broadly
expanding the
definition.
definition of a provincially significant wetland that falls under this provincial policy statement, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
then should we be eliminating some of these? I'm not going to call them loopholes, but they're essentially development opportunities if you meet certain criteria.
Yeah. So I think there's a good case to be made to say, particularly, and I think that's really what the province has said in the Greenbelt is, whatever is left is significant. Whether you put it through the M&R's evaluation system, it is significant, just by virtue of the rarity and the impacts on those wetlands. So when we first got engaged in the Provincial Policy Statement Review 4 years ago, we were throwing out the idea that let's talk about a greenbelt style wetland policy across southern Ontario. I mean, in parts of southwestern Ontario, you're down to 10, 15, or even 5% of the historic wetlands. Surely we have enough science to say that that's not sustainable to continue down that path. I don't think the province is ready to go there yet. But.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah.
Just to follow up with this discussion, I think it's worth noting that in Ontario, many conservation authorities have enacted regulations to afford protection to not only provincially significant wetlands, but non-provincially significant wetlands and unevaluated wetlands. So that shouldn't be lost in this discussion. The Grand River Conservation Authority actually protects wetlands as small as half a hectare in size and below. So you can have a wetland that's less than half a hectare in size that's part of a provincially significant wetland complex that will be afforded protection.
Thank you. All right, so
I'm just wondering if there's somewhere internationally or perhaps within Canada that Ontario should be basing a new policy on. If we're looking at making a new draft, is there somewhere doing it better, I guess?
Well, by my, Dr. Rudy can speak to that better, but I would say an Alberta style policy in Ontario would be a pretty big step up. In New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have similar sort of overarching policies and visions and high-level objectives. So I think we can look to those to pick up pieces that we think might work here in Ontario. Absolutely.
So if Alberta is doing it better than us, then we should get our act together. Okay, so the last question goes to Merrin to start. How can wetlands protection and the agricultural sector work together to their mutual benefit? This is actually a little bit a question stolen from the Ramsar website of this year.
Okay, so with respect to wetlands, when we think about agriculture and we think about the threats that are facing wetlands, I think you could really classify those into three main areas: water quality issues, water quantity issues, and general loss of wetlands. And I think a point that needs to be made with respect to agriculture is that we need to eat. We need crops. We need food. And so the question, it doesn't necessarily mean that agriculture has to be at the expense of wetlands. And I do think that these sectors can work together to their mutual benefit. So just to touch on each of these, with respect to water quality, we know that nutrients and pollutants from agricultural systems can end up in our wetland systems downstream from those areas. Ideally, we want to keep the fertilizers. We want to keep these contaminants on the fields. But that's something we're both after, both wetlands, preservation and conservation, but also in agriculture, because it's obviously not economically it doesn't make economic sense, and it's not really good from a crop success standpoint if all of your nutrients are running off into your wetlands downstream. So with continued technology, science, and education, I think obviously we can work towards that goal. But it's also important that wetlands downstream from agriculture or down gradient from agricultural systems have this wonderful ability to trap pollutants that do come off of the agricultural fields. And this is great because these have value. Okay, and so a lot of managers recognize this value, and this is something that has been encouraged. So I think this is something that can maintain the existence of wetlands in our agricultural systems and even encourage the expansion or construction of new ones. From a water quantity issue, there are a lot of agricultural systems where we rely on wetlands to supply water for irrigation, for example, or for livestock, and that's really important. And there are some areas globally and even across Canada where this is becoming increasingly important, and it may become more important under certain climate change scenarios. So obviously we need to work, technologically speaking, to improve our irrigation and crop technologies, but I think there's also opportunities for the drainage of agricultural lands and even more urban settings into wetlands. And that can be to the benefit of the wetland in terms of sustaining the water supply, and then that can cleanse the water that can be then recycled. So there's a lot of attention recently in some areas to the use of these systems in terms of recycling, both water but also nutrients. And so that's something I think that has a tremendous amount of potential in future. So I think we really need to move to this and really promote through education this ecosystem mentality, or just the importance of these two systems to coexist, and that I think we can use wetlands sustainably that can assist us and enhance our agriculture, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of the wetlands. So.
Thank you. Anyone wants to add anything to this?
Just a question. I think, Kevin, you might have mentioned some projects where farmers choose to add constructed wetlands to their property. Is that true, or does that not happen?
Well, just to clarify, you know, in our world, we talk about restoring wetlands, or in some cases enhancing wetlands. And then the priority is always to restore, to find a wetland, a historic wetland that's been impacted typically by, you know, hydrological impact, drainage, and then work to restore that. So we don't, you know, the terminology I think is important too. Constructed wetlands to me, I think of treatment wetlands that are specifically designed to remove contaminants. That's not what we sort of.
Right. You just mean but I think you mentioned ditch plug at some point.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if that is, you know, on an active farm, like that you're working with a farmer. I'm wondering, because this is about agricultural and wetlands working together. So is there a pitch or incentive for a farmer to want that on their property?
I think there's a guy right in front of you there who's
Yeah, there's numerous examples of those kind of projects taking place directly in response to a benefit to agriculture production. Down in the Delhi area, 2006, and that there was a fairly dry year, and a lot of irrigation goes on. So they actually ended up working with the agricultural community and the Ontario Drainage Act. Under Section 78.1 of the Drainage Act, it allows for the installation of water control structures within the municipal drains. So what they were doing is they were plugging, through the Drainage Act, they were strategically placing plugs within the drains to recharge the wetlands where the hydrology had been altered historically, to store water back on the landscape where it could be accessible for irrigation purposes for the farmers. So again, there was a direct support and encouragement by the farmers to make this happen. So there's numerous projects all across Ontario now.
Okay, so it's perfectly on time. Thanks to the chair of the So I'd like to thank all the panelists. So right after this, we have the reception following in the fishbowl. The winner of the student poster award will also be announced in the fishbowl. So I invite you all to join us there. But again, I would like to thank the panel.